Hi, and welcome back to the Mifflin County E-Yarn Club. Today I'm going to be showing you how to knit the classic knit hat that is available on the Little Gray Heart website. For this project you will need a circular knitting needle that should measure 16 inches from tip to tip. You will need double pointed needles. You will need a darning needle, a measuring tape, and scissors and stitch markers. Now, some of the skills that you're going to need for this project is being able to cast on 2 circular knitting needles, join in the round, knit 2x2 ribbing, be able to decrease stitches, and eventually transfer those stitches over to double pointed needles. Also, you will need to be able to do a swatch to get the correct gauge for your hat. Alright, let's start off by looking at how we do a gauge swatch. Alright, I have here my gauge swatch. Now, the gauge for this project is 18 stitches across in 4 inches and 22 rows in 4 inches. So because of that, I cast on more than 18 stitches and I did up more than 22 rows. I started off and I just knit 4 rows of garter stitch just so my gauge swatch will end up laying nice and flat and be easier for me to count. And then I did stockinette stitch, which is knit 1 row, purl 1 row, knit 1 row, purl 1 row. And you also notice that on the sides here I have it in garter stitch as well, so I'm just knitting those 4 stitches on each side every time. That's just so it will lay nice and flat and make it easier for me to count. So okay, the gauge is that I need 4 inches to have 18 stitches in it across. So what I did is I went and I counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. So alright. And you can see I put a stitch marker at the beginning and then where I stopped counting. So I know that in between these 2 stitch markers is 18 stitches. So I'm going to take my tape measure here and lay it out and see that I do indeed have 18 stitches in 4 inches. So I did get the correct gauge for the number of stitches across. The next step is making sure I had the correct number of rows in 4 inches. So I did go and I counted up here for 22 rows. And what you're looking for to count the rows, and I'll pick this up to make it a little bit easier for you to see. And I'm going to pull it apart here. You'll see those little individual V's right there. So you're counting each one of them. This can get a little tricky, but be patient with yourself. You will get it. So I went and I did that and I counted up 22 rows. So I'm going to lay this here. And alright. And yes, I do have the correct number of rows in 4 inches. So I'm now all good to go. So alright, now that I know I have the correct gauge, and I got that gauge by using size 9 circular knitting needles, I'm going to use my size 9 circular knitting needles to make my hat. Now, one important thing about what kind of circular knitting needles to use, the only important thing, no matter which size needle you need to use, because that will vary depending on how tight you knit or how loose you knit. You may need a smaller or a bigger size needle. I knit very tight, so I had to go with a size 9. But the important thing is that from this tip all around to this tip is 16 inches. This is important because if the cord's any longer than that, and the whole circumference is longer than 16 inches, it is going to be very hard, if not impossible, to join in the round. In which, if we can't join in the round, then we won't be able to knit our hat. So, alright, I'm going to start and cast on my stitches. Okay, I've cast on my 80 stitches, and I've actually gone and cast on one extra stitch, and I'll show you why here in a moment. Now, before we join in the round, we need to make sure that all of our stitches are facing the right way, none of them are twisted, because that will cause problems here later on down the line if I have twisted stitches. So now that I made sure that I don't, I'm ready to join in the round. So I'm going to take this last stitch here, which you'll see is my slip knot, and I'm going to move that just right over onto my left hand needle. Then this last stitch that I've cast on, that was my extra stitch, just going to pull it a little loose, take it and slide it over that, and then go down here, yank on these to tighten it up, and we are now joined in the round. I'm going to go and move that stitch back over to the needle on my right hand, and again go and tighten up that stitch just to make sure it stays looking good and it's not gonna just pull on these and make sure that's tight and make sure it's staying looking good and not all nasty loosey-goosey. So I'm then going to pick up my working yarn and I'm ready to start knitting in the round, except for the fact that I need another stitch marker here, that it's different from any of the others that I have on here that I used to just keep track of how many stitches I had whenever I was casting on. I'm going to place it there. And now this pattern calls for us to start in our 2x2 ribbing. So I'm just going to go right into that, and just like my previous video, we do 2x2 ribbing by knitting 2 stitches. And your stitches might be tight, they might be loose, so this may be easier or harder for you. The first row is typically always the most difficult because it can be a little tight. So just be patient with yourself. Once you get past that first row, it will get easier. And then I'm going to purl 2 here. And then knit 2. And I'm gonna just move the yarn around here because I'm getting mighty tight right up here. So I just scooch it around a little bit. And there. Now it's not going to be quite so tight there. And I'm going to purl 2. And then knit 2. And so whenever I was casting on, I had put the stitch markers every 10 stitches. So I'm going to just let that stitch marker come off because I don't need it anymore. The only one I need is this one here saying, hey, this is where you joined in the round. So whenever you get to this stitch, it's a start of a new round. And you just keep working like that for 10 rows of 2x2 ribbing. You go knit 2, purl 2, knit 2, purl 2. And I'll show you what to do here in a little bit whenever you say get to the end of your first row and you're going to start the second. You're going to, again, just knit these and then purl those. But I'll come back and show you that whenever I'm at that point. Alright, as you can see, since I made it back to my stitch marker, and I've removed all the others that were every 10 stitches, helping me keep track of how many stitches I had cast on, I'm now ready to start row 2, and it is really simple. I'm once again just going to knit 2, purl 2. And now my stitches are still pretty tight, so I made it kind of difficult for myself. It's always best to try and keep your stitches just loose enough that you can easily get your needles in there. But not so loose that you have them sliding off. And one thing is, you do want to be careful about splitting your yarn. Like, see right there, that only caught like that little bit. So I took it off and made sure I put it through the whole loop. Now I'm just going to tighten that up a little bit, and it's now good to go. So alright, I knitted 2, I purled 2, I'm ready to go back to knit. And again, I'm just repeating this the whole way around for row 2, and I will keep doing that until I have 10 rows of 2x2 ribbing. And once I have that, I will come back and show you the next steps. Alright, so now that I have done my 10 rows of 2x2 ribbing, by just continuously doing knit 2, purl 2 for 10 rows. And one way you can check yourself is that you should always have 2 purl stitches here right before the beginning of your next row, and you're always going to knit the first 2 stitches in the next row. So it honestly goes in a perfect pattern. You will never do anything but knit 2 stitches and then purl 2 stitches. So thankfully that makes it nice and easy for us. We don't have to keep too much complex information in our head while we're working. We just have to remember I'm always doing knit 2 and purl 2 for 10 rows. And you can keep track of those rows any way you would like. I have an app on my phone that allows me to just tap and then it marks that I did another row. However, even if you say have a handful of coins available, you could move one over to a new pile each time. You know, anything like that that you would want to use to help you keep track. So now we are ready to move on to the next part of this pattern, which thankfully is very easy. We are just going to start knitting, doing knit stitch after knit stitch after knit stitch. And this is going to give us the stockinette stitch because we are knitting in the round. If you're knitting in the flat, to get stockinette stitch you have to knit 1 row then purl 1 row. However, since we are working in the round, all we have to do is just the knit stitch. And I'm going to keep doing this until I reach 7 inches from here up to wherever that 7 inches would then end. So as you're going, you want to measure and make sure that from the cast on edge to where you stop just continuously doing knit stitches, that it measures 7 inches. Again, this will be stated in the pattern that I am going to link in the description below. So this again is very simple. Just keep doing the knit stitch for row after row until you have 7 inches of material away from the cast on edge. You might be wondering if you need to keep track of your rows, and no, you don't. However, we know that if we have done 44 rows, that should give us 8 inches, because 22 rows gave us 4 inches if we were able to match the gauge properly whenever we did our gauge swatch. So that can give us a general ballpark. So if you want to keep track of your rows so you know when you're getting close, that way you're not constantly pulling out your tape measure thinking, am I there yet? Because I know it can be so exciting when it looks like, oh, I'm so close to being done. And you want to know, so you can go, I know I can get a little impatient and probably measure it more times than really is necessary. So it can be nice just to be like, okay, well, I know I've only done this many, and I need to do at least this many to get that length. It can help that in anxiety a little bit. And also, it is nice that way, you know, if you're new to this and you don't want to end up accidentally making your hat too long, you know, say if 44 rows would have given us 8 inches, maybe stop whenever you've counted that you've done 30 rows. That way you know, okay, I should be getting fairly close. Let me just, you know, pull out and measure this and see how much further I actually need to go. And so, yeah, I will come back whenever I have my 7 inches worth of material made. And then we will go over how to move these stitches onto double pointed needles. Because after I've done the 7 inches, that's when I'm going to start the decreases to make the crown of the hat. And for me, it's just much easier to switch the stitches over to double pointeds for that part of the project. While I have enough wiggle room on here that I could take some stitches off before I go to double pointed needles, I could do some of the decreases. I'm going to choose to switch over before I start the decreasing, just so I don't take the chance of, oh, well, here I'm in the middle and now it's just too tight. And that can also just make the process of switching them over to double pointed needles just a little bit more difficult. So I'm just going to make it easier on myself by switching over beforehand. And one last thing about this first row that you do after the ribbing might be a little bit of a pain. It shouldn't be too bad. I knit really tight and I'm able to do it without, you know, my stitches flying off or anything like that. But just be patient with yourself. Try not to, you know, get too frustrated, and it will get easier after you get past this first row. It's just like whenever you're casting on, that first row after you cast on can be a real booger, but the next rows do go a whole lot easier. So, alright, I'll be back to show you how to move your stitches over to double pointed needles. Alright, I am now going to show you how to take your knitting off of the circular needles and put it onto double pointed needles. Now I'm using the same size double pointed as I am circular needles, so they're both US 9 or 5.5 millimeter. And this process, thankfully, really is not that hard. There's just a few things you want to keep in mind whenever you're doing it. It's like, so right here I at the beginning of my round. So I'm going to take 10 stitches and just slide them through. Alright, so that's 10 on that side. I'm now going to take my stitch marker off, slide it on to my double pointed needle. I'm going to take that, slide that stitches down my double pointed so they don't slide off so easily. I'm also going to slide this up a little bit out, that way they stay on properly. And this fell off. Gotta be careful to make sure that does stay back on. And now I'm going to take 10 from this side. Alright, and there we go. Now I have 20 stitches on this double pointed needle. Now I want 20 stitches on this needle because altogether I have 80 stitches, and I'm going to be putting them onto altogether 4 double pointed needles. So that will end up with 20 on each. That will spread them out nice and evenly so that they aren't necessarily all bunched together, crowded on the needle and then slipping off. But I've also chosen to do this way because the pattern tells us to place a stitch marker every 10 stitches. So I know that whenever I slide 20 on to a double pointing needle right in the middle between 2 sets of 10, I can put a stitch marker, and then that stitch marker should always be in the middle of the stitches that I have on my double pointing needle. And so now we're going to move on and get the stitches on the next needle. Okay, so I'm going to pick up my next double pointing needle. I'm going to go from this direction, and again just slide 10 on. Okay, so I believe I got 10 on there. I'm just going to double check. Yep, I got 10. So now I'm going to take a stitch marker, and I'm using a different color from the one that marks the beginning of the next round, because otherwise I'll get lost and confused and not know whenever I need to move on to the next set of instructions for the next round. So now I'm going to slide another 10 stitches on, and unlike last time, I'm not going back around this way to get the last 10 stitches. I'm just going to continue on around this way. I had to go back that way for the previous one. That way I would have the beginning of my round right in the middle of those stitches there. Alright, so that is another 20 stitches on a double pointed needle. So I will move on to the next one. And just counting 10. Alright, I'm going to put my stitch marker on here. And do another 10. So now if everything worked out properly, there should only be 20 stitches on here. Left on, and then my circular knitting needle can be set to the side. So, alright. I will place my last stitch marker, then cast off transfer. We don't want to be casting off any stitches just yet. Not ready for that yet. And alright. That is all my stitches transferred over onto my double pointed needles. And it looks like everything worked out properly because I have 20 stitches on each needle. So, alrighty. I'm now going to pick up the 5th needle and use it to work with. And this is where it can get a little tricky working with double pointed needles, because often you'll want to use this one to work onto this one, and that doesn't ruin your project. It just means you're going to end up with way too many stitches on this needle, and you'll have to readjust and transfer them back onto the proper needle that they're supposed to be on. So if that happens, no need to panic. Just remember, especially at the beginning, you want 20 stitches on each needle. So that will help you figure out which one you need to add the stitches back to or take the stitches off of. So, alright. And right now, I'm actually going to transfer the first 10 stitches over. That one's bunched a little bit weird. There we go. because I am starting in the beginning of a new round. Okay, I'm all set up here. I'm at the beginning of the first round for our decreasing, working on making the crown of our hat. And the instructions say for round 1, knit 8 stitches, knit 2 together, and then repeat that again and again until you reach the end of the round. Now what's nice is that I know I have 10 stitches on each side of these clips. So I can literally work up to the last 2 stitches and then just knit those 2 together. So I'll show you that here. I already had knit the very first stitch, so I'm just going to knit, knit, knit. And alright, the next step is to knit these 2 stitches together. Now this can be a little tricky, especially on the first row after you've transferred over to double pointeds, because things can be a little tight. And there we go. And you just heard that one slide away. That needle. I'm going to have to get that back. So, alright, I'll show you that again. So, now I know I got 10 stitches on this side of the stitch marker, so I'm just going to knit. Knit. Alright, so I'm at the last 2. So I'm taking my needle down going through both the loops, picking up the yarn, and then pulling it through. Again, like I said, on the first round, it can be a little tricky. Just be patient with yourself. Alright, and I'm sliding that stitch marker over because I don't want to lose that. That's going to help me keep track of where I am. And now we're going to just do it again. Now, another thing that may be making this a little bit harder for me is the fact that I did switch from using a wooden circular needle to metal double-pointed needles. Typically, that is not something you want to do. If you use a metal circular needle, you want to use metal double-pointed needles if you're switching over. And vice versa, if you're using wooden needles, you want to use wooden double-pointeds for when you switch over, because they actually do change the tension in your knitting a little bit. So that can affect the outcome. However, in this pattern, I don't believe it should be very much of a change at all. So I'm willing to risk it, since these were what I had on hand in the right size. But typically, it is not advisable to switch like that. Alright, I'm at another decrease. So again, I'm going to go up through and hook the yarn, pull it through. I can tell I split the yarn a little bit there, so I'm going to fix that and make sure I have the whole yarn. There we go. Alright, slip over. And okay. So I knit those 2 8, so now I'm gonna get my needle up through there and pull it through. Alright, one more double pointing needle till we're almost back to the beginning of the row. And you do want to check every once in a while just to make sure the stitches are staying in a nice position on the double pointing needle so they're not going to slide off. If you're really having a problem with that, they do make little stoppers that can go on the ends of the needles. It would get to be a little bit of a pain if every time you go to the end of your needles you have to remove it. But if you're really having a problem, that little bit of an inconvenience is better than a ton of drop stitches that can really just mess up your work and make it hard for you. That happens every now and then. You accidentally take off the stitch before it's ready. Just carefully slide it back on. Alright, and there we go. Again, up through. And pull that. Yep, just like that. Move the stitch marker over. And knit another 8 stitches. Alright, so this is the last knit 2 together for that round. Alright, so I'm going to slip my round indicator over to the other side. And I'm now ready to work round 2. And that is knit all the stitches. So just like we were doing before, to get our 7 inches of length, we're just going to go and knit around. And I'm going to come back then to show you round 3. and the decreases there. Alright, I did my row 2, which was just knitting every stitch the whole way around until I got back to this blue marker here. So now we are going to do round 3, which is knit 7 and then knit 2 together until we reach the end of the round. So exactly like row 1, except we're only knitting 7 instead of 8, but that makes sense because we have one less stitch in each set of 10 here because we knit them together the previous round. So again, this is a little tricky to do while looking through a camera. Alright, there we go. So that leaves us with 8 stitches. On that side of the stitch marker. Now, one thing when you're working with double pointed needles, you do want to watch your tension here when you're switching from one to the other, because if it's too loose, you'll see like a bunch of the lines in between. It will be really gappy, they'll be visible, and you don't want that. You want your knitting to be nice, neat, and tight. So maybe when you do that first stitch, give it a nice extra tug just to make sure it's good and tight, and you won't get any ugly jogging is what it's called. So. Wanted to let you know that in case this is your first double pointed needle project. Alright, so I got to the last 2 stitches, so I'm just gonna knit those 2 together. There we go. Now that needle won't be blocking your guys' view. Alright, or my view, for that matter. Alrighty. And you'll hopefully find that this row goes a little easier for you because it shouldn't be as tight as the one that we did right away off of the circular needles. So hopefully just go a little smoother for you, and plus you now have a little bit of a chance to get used to how to hold the double pointed needles. Can be a little tricky figuring out what's a comfortable way for you to hold them. Alright, got to the last 2. That one didn't work out the way I wanted it to, so I'm going to try again. There we go. Slide my stitch marker over. Here we go. Yep, just gonna stick my needle through both those loops like I'm gonna knit them. Go through and pull the yarn through, and then there we go. And I think this is the last round I'm gonna completely demonstrate, just because it's all the exact same. You're just changing the number of stitches you knit before you do the knit two together. So thankfully you guys should be able to get in a nice rhythm. We're going to do one row where we knit a certain number of stitches and then knit two together. Then the next row after that, it's just going to be a knit one stitch the whole way around. And just keep, this is my knit two together. Okay. So pattern, yep, just keeps repeating where it will give you instructions for how many to knit before you knit two together. Then the round after that's just going to be, just go ahead and knit every stitch. The reason they do that is because that does stabilize the previous round. And you generally don't want to do a decrease right on top of a decrease without a row where you knit that last stitch. And that is one thing you have to watch out with double pointing needles. Occasionally they can drop out just like that. So I just carefully set it down and I'm going to pick up my needle. And now I'm just going to carefully pick up these last two stitches. There we go. They're back on. So now I'm going to knit these two together and get them on their way. One thing I would suggest, if this is your first time knitting with double pointed needles, it might be best not to use metal ones and use wooden ones, because believe it or not, the material does play a big part in how slippy your stitches are. These wooden circulars, because the fact they're wood, they have just an ever so slight bit of grip to them. Whereas these metal ones, very slick. And it's very easy for them just to slide right off. So, alright, it's time to do the last bit of row 3. And there we are. Alright, since I have shown you how to do the knit two together decrease, I'm going to then complete the crown of my hat up to the point where I have finished round 15. And I will meet you guys back when I'm at that point. Alright, I am now ready to cut the yarn, detach it from my ball, and then take it and finish off the brim of my hat here. So I'm going to leave myself a decent amount of yarn just to make sure it's nice and easy for me to get this through. Alright, I'm going to pick up my needle here. And I'm probably going to have to do this off camera because I don't think I'm going to be able to thread this on camera by looking through. So give me just a moment here. Alright. There we go. Alright, so now I have my hat here. See, this piece of yarn's coming straight out from that stitch. Just Gonna move that needle a little bit to make sure it stays put. And first thing I'm going to do is slide off that stitch marker. Then I'm going to take this down through. Gonna just put that right through. Pretty much the same thing we were doing whenever we were transferring from double pointeds to, or from my circular needles to double pointeds. But now we're just putting them on a string of yarn. Alright, so that's those two. And now time to move on to these four. Gonna start with these two. There's a stitch marker. Pull that through. Alright. And the last two here. And so yeah, this is the part you get to do after you've done all 15 rounds of the crown decrease. And you see, this is going to let us just basically cinch this up real nice and tight. I'm going to show you one other little trick before we actually do that. Alright, so yeah, I'm just going to keep doing this till I get all the stitches off the double pointed needles. I only have 6 more to do. Alright, here we go. Okay, we're down to the last 2 stitches. Alright. So you can see now, we got them all on that piece of yarn. I'm now, and this is a little trick, you can just pull it tight like right now, like that, but it makes it a little bit neater if you actually take this, put it through that hole that's on the top, because right now this here is the outside of the hat. So we're going to turn it inside out and work from this end, from the inside, because that way anything we're doing now is going to be tucked away on the inside and not visible. So there we go. So now I'm just pulling that as tight as I can. That way it's nice and neat and clean. And then I'm going to take my needle, just poke it through there. And there we go. So now you see I got a loop going. And I am actually going to take the needle and put it through that loop. This is going to just further secure the stitches in place. And since it's on the inside, it's not going to be visible. Alright, and then you just stick it through and start weaving it in a little bit. And you can just keep weaving it in until you feel like you've done it enough that it shouldn't come loose. And if it were to come loose, you'd have enough thread there, you know, to kind of go back and fix it. do try and do it in such a way that it's not going to leave like an uncomfortable bump somewhere on the knitting. So I think that's actually pretty good. So I'm now ready to just take this, go, and there we go. That is the crown of the hat finished. So now the last thing I have to do is just right here, this end. So I'm just going to thread my needle here. And alright, I'm going to choose to work from the what would be the inside of the hat. Now, but because someone might choose to curl or to flip the brim up like that, I am going to do my best to make this as neat as possible. But I noticed that there's a little bit of a gap there, so I'm just actually going to take it and work on just closing that up a little bit. So I'm just going to go right across like that. Then just going to go right across back. And alright, that actually looks fairly good. So now I'm just going to work on weaving in this end. Now you want to make sure that when you're weaving an end, you don't pull it too tight, because you don't want to make a unsightly bunch in the fabric side. You only just give it a few tugs around, let it just kind of loosen up, sit into place. And I think I'm going to call that good there. So then like that, and I am all done. This is a fun little project that can be done in about, say, a week. I think you should be able to get this done in about a week or less if you, given the amount of time you have to work on it in a given day. I would say if I could actually probably get this done in one full day if I could work on it uninterrupted. So I'd say about probably a 12-ish hour project, give or take. But I hope you have enjoyed this project and that you enjoy making your hat. And that whether or not you keep it for yourself or give it to someone else, I hope they enjoy wearing it. And I hope you all have had a very Merry Christmas. And I will catch you next time on the Mifflin County E-Yarn Club.